who was victorious in the First Crusade?
The Crusaders, which is quite amazing when you look at it as an historical event. In fact, I can think of no other event in human history where you have tens of thousands of armed men marching thousands of miles from home deep into enemy territory with no supply lines and no clear plan, and being as successful as they were. They essentially completed all of the goals that they could have wanted to complete.
They re-Christianized Turkey?
No, there's no re-Christianization. The purpose of the Crusades was never to actually Christianize anyone. There was no aspect.
No, I don't mean. I'm sorry. I used shorthand. They were able to remove the Muslim dominance in Turkey?
They were able to take significant areas of it. They took the city of Nicaea, which had recently been turned into the capital of the Turkish kingdom there, and restored that to Christian control. And then they laid siege to Antioch, which had been one of the ancient patriarchal sees of Christianity, and restored that also to Christian control before leaving Asia Minor.
And
so
Jerusalem?
took a big swath of it. Then they headed down south through what's today Syria and Jordan, and there they just passed by cities for the moment. This area was very broken up between both Turks and Arabs at the time, and so most of the various groups were willing just to stay out of it as long as they knew the Crusaders were heading to Jerusalem. And they finally went to Jerusalem and conquered the city in 1099. And from there, they created now a kind of a little kingdom of Jerusalem and began conquering other territories around that. Eventually, within the next 25 years, they were able to build a small kingdom that encompassed really the whole coastal area there. So really the whole area that's today Israel, Jordan.
What was the name of that
Syria.
kingdom?
The Kingdom of Jerusalem.
Though it extended well beyond Jerusalem.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And why is then there a need for a second crusade?
Because 40 years later, the reason that the Crusaders were successful was because Muslims in the area were disunified. As soon as any Muslim leaders started to unify various Muslim groups, they could always defeat the Crusaders because they were in their home territory and the Crusaders weren't. In 1144, a Muslim leader, Nur ad-Din, conquered the city of Edessa, which was one of the peripheral cities that had been held by the Crusaders. And this then, because it was the first loss that the Crusaders had suffered, this news reached Europe, and the Pope called a new crusade to restore that city. But I have to say that with the Second Crusade, you had a kind of it was rather like in the Middle Ages, rather like the Greatest Generation. It had been 45 years since the First Crusade, and people remembered the Crusaders from the First Crusade in mythic ways. And so when this happened and gave Europeans an excuse to crusade again, just thousands of them took the cross. And a lot of it had to do with remembering.
And where did they go? They didn't all go to Odessa.
No, most of them ended up being killed by the Turks in Asia Minor. As I said, most of the Crusades didn't work after that. The First Crusade was victorious, both because of Muslim disunity, but also because they took the Muslim kingdoms completely by surprise, and those various kingdoms were not used to the kinds of warfare that Europeans fought, like the Frankish charge. But by 1144, the Turks and the Arabs knew about the Crusaders and the Westerners pretty well, and they were able to counter those things. So most of the Crusaders were killed.
All right, we're going to take your questions now. Anything you'd like to know, challenge, whatever, about the Crusades. 1-8-PRAGER-776, 1-8-PRAGER-776. Professor Thomas Madden and Dennis Prager. All right, time to learn more about the Crusades. The author of the new Concise History of the Crusades, Professor of History, St. Louis University, Professor Thomas Madden, widely accepted book and historian with no, doesn't seem to me he has an axe to grind. in any direction here. We're going to take some calls now, and then I'll proceed with more questions from me. We begin in Cleveland, and John, you're on with Thomas Madden and Dennis Prager. Hi.
Mr. Prager, Professor Madden, it's an honor to talk to you both.
Thank you.
I understand what okay, this is going to be a question, and please excuse me if I stutter. I'm trying to put it in the proper words. Even though the Crusades were there to try to take back the Holy Land from the Muslims, wasn't also an underlying anti-Semitism because they also wanted to push the Jewish people out of the Holy Land? And I will hang up and listen for your answer. Mr. Prager, again, it was an honor to talk to you.
You're very kind, John. Thank you. Professor Madden.
There certainly was anti-Semitism in Europe, and there had been for some time, and that sometimes manifested itself by crusaders who, not so much in Europe, not so much in the Middle East, but in Europe, doing things against the Jews that they were not supposed to be doing. But the Crusades themselves, there was no concept of dealing with the Jews as part of the Crusades. In fact, I can't think of Jews ever having been mentioned in a crusading bull or proclamation that ever went out. It just wasn't part of the mission of a crusade. Jews were tolerated and accepted in Europe. Now there were some crusades where you essentially had rogue elements of the crusade decide that what was necessary was to attack local Jews. This happened during the First Crusade and the Second Crusade. And even a bit during the Third Crusade, where you had these rogue elements attacking Jews in German cities along the Rhineland, for example, and rationalizing this as that Christ's enemies were not only far away, but that they were right here at home as well. The Crusade preachers often talked about how Christ was crucified again by all of the bad things that were being done to his people in the Middle East by Muslims. And so it was natural, well, not natural, but some people then listened to that and then said, well, if Christ is crucified again, then shouldn't we be attacking those people who crucified him in the first place, who are the Jews? This was not what the Crusade preachers had in mind, but unfortunately it did happen sometimes.
Yeah, whole communities in Germany of Jews were just massacred.
Yeah, along the Rhineland in several of the cities, there were whole communities destroyed. That's right.
But it is important to note that the Jews did seek refuge with the church officials, but it didn't help.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. The church was very clear on Jewish persecutions, and that is that they were forbidden. And so when these so-called Crusaders came to town, the Jews would then go to the bishop's palace and seek refuge. And in several cases, the bishops opened their homes to them and brought all the Jews in and told these Crusaders to go away. But they weren't listened to. They broke into the bishop's palace and killed the Jews.
Who was the leader of the First Crusade, the military leader?
There's really no one leader. There were several leaders. It was kind of a product of a committee. And there was a council of very powerful barons who led the First Crusade. Once it was all finished, the top leader when people remembered it, they tended to remember Godfrey of Bouillon because he was the one who ended up becoming the first king of Jerusalem. But during the Crusade itself, there were many leaders, and they did everything really in a committee. They decided what they were going to do in a committee.